Thank you, Uncle Ashraf. Uh, so I I don't say that in jest though, but it's very purposeful because of what's happening within the industry right now. We are starting to see this massive shift where generations are actually now 4 years apart, 3 years apart. So both from a point of respect, but also as a recognition that we need to start without haste, moving a little bit quicker in the way that we start to integrate. So I want to do something slightly different for this particular talk. Let me start off with trying to deflate this AI hype bubble just a little bit. But quickly, just by a show of hands, I'm assuming everybody here knows of ChatGPT. Who here has used a system like Chat or Claude? Who uses it every day? So about 80, 90% of the room. How many of you here know what GPT stands for? Less than 10. Okay. Um, for those of you who've actually read the Transformer paper, let's have a conversation afterwards because to the spirit of Ikra, I think we actually need to go back and learn where are the places that we need to read. But for those of you who don't know, it stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. Each of those are different technical elements of how it pulls together, but I'm not going to focus on that too much today. Let's take a look at what's happening within the industry right now. There's unfortunately this hyperinflation that's happening with respect to how VC funding within Silicon Valley started to influence different companies. If you have the .ai domain or you have AI within your company logo, you automatically inflate it. And it's from an Islamic point of view, it's completely unfair and unjust about the way we bring services to humanity. Where we are, where we'd like to be, is completely different from where we tell people we are. And it's largely driven by money. Um, and I say that in a way that makes me believe that people don't know what money is within the true spirit of it, right? For me, the ethics and the ethos of money is actually service. Money is the thing that you get as a feedback for providing service. So the focus point should never be let's go and try and get money. No. The focus is how do we service humanity, and then the money will come as a feedback signal. The moment we've lost that, we start chasing the wrong metrics. And it's important to know that whatever metrics you chase, that's what you end up becoming. So there's a very famous saying from a statistician that points out that all models are wrong, but some are more useful than others. So when I talk about the model here, I'm talking about something like ChatGPT. Uh, to give you an idea, let's look at the different building blocks of AI and how it's transformed right now. The reason why we have these systems is because there's been fundamental shifts in each of these different categories. Data itself has gotten larger than we've ever seen before. I think by some estimates, the internet right now is 27 yottabytes large. That's like 24 zeros, essentially. So there's a massive amount of more data now that we could ever process. From a compute point of view, from the silicon, we have now gone down to a sub 2 nanometer transistor chip, which means that transistors are now smaller than a DNA strand. So as we start proceeding, you are going to start seeing more circuitry that involves integration with the human body. And I can talk at length after this about what that looks like. Some research coming out of MIT, for example. And finally, architectures. When it comes to the different sizes of these computational systems that we've seen, um, some of the biggest systems are like 1.5, 1.6 terabyte, 1.6 trillion parameters large. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's okay. It just means that we've got algorithms that are traditionally bigger than it's ever been. We typically need a whole supercomputer with 1,000 GPUs to process a single prompt like ChatGPT does. It's convenient, but it's not very green. I know some people will be up in arms about that. Let me take you through a quick history of AI. One thing people don't understand is that AI is actually a field of study, like medicine is a field of operation. What it looks at, or the way it looks is the original Dartmouth conference was where the founding fathers, very patriarchal, had all just stepped into a room and said, as a group of um, as university professors and people that come from industry, how do we actually proceed with creating intelligent systems? And we can talk a little bit about what intelligence means in this case. But since then, the world has proceeded from building computational algorithms that are sequential in nature, step by step, to this machine learning type of paradigm. Machine learning is basically this idea where you don't code up things anymore, you teach it by example. You give it inputs, you get an output, and the moment it's wrong, you bob it on the nose and you tell it why it's wrong, and then it course corrects itself. It builds its own algorithm. But right now, they are as large as supercomputers. And the reason why is because of deep learning that came about by being inspired by the human brain and the way neurons work, and then foundation models that scale things up massively. And that's where generative AI basically comes in. So, one thing I want to point out is how competitive the Gen AI landscape is right now. Um, if you look at just this conference, we've been here for more than 6 hours. Since we started this morning, over 1,000 models have been updated. That's the pace at which this landscape is changing, to the point of that was made earlier that you need to do things in the open. We've now changed the paradigm to creating things and testing it out to we are perpetually flying this plane as we are building it. We are always live. It's never not the case. If you aren't, then you are not active in the different areas that are always changing. You need to be on GitHub, you need to be on Hugging Face. It's extremely expensive to operate and to build. Um, you need a massive cluster in order to create systems like this. By some estimates, there are about 10 to 20 companies within the United States that can build LLMs. It's very few, and the reason why is because it requires a large server farm in order to do that. But the expense is not just monetary, the expense is also on the environment. So, for example, every single prompt that you send to a chat like system, it burns up one of these bottles of water. Every single prompt. If each one of us here had to build our own ChatGPT system, train it from scratch, it would exhaust the entire ESCOM budget from just this room. That's how large these systems are. It's extremely expensive. And they are massive data aggregators. What ends up happening along with that is there's a lot of legal concerns, a lot of litigation that's coming down the pipeline because it aggregates the entire internet's worth of data within a single snapshot, and then it learns the patterns within that. And because of it, there are concerns about what data should you put out, and how do we tell whether data itself can be used for training these large models or not. And one massive problem, and I think this is going to affect the Muslim community more than most, is the idea that these systems hallucinate or confabulate. They make stuff up. They don't know how to say, I don't know, because that's not what they fundamentally are trained to do. They are auto completion systems on steroids. They just next word predictors, right? Um, and that's particularly problematic when it comes to building AI systems, specifically Gen AI systems that integrate with things like the Quran. What happens when you ask questions about the Quran when this system can actually hallucinate what an ayah is in the first place, something that should be set in stone? So we need to be very careful as a community around how we actually build and where we choose to integrate these types of systems into the things that we build. One important consideration, especially for me as a practitioner, is I've noticed how we've moved towards bleeding edge technology to the point where consultants are starting to sell a thing before it matures, before we even know what the use cases are. We end up in this case where somebody who builds a technology like this foundation model doesn't know the ways and the means by which it can be used and it's successful. And because of that, we end up selling the entire platform and leaving it up to the client. You decide where the use case is. And based on your use case, in some scenarios you'll find utility because some models, have utility. But we need to be very cautious about how we start to integrate with this. And there's no maturity just yet, so we don't know where it succeeds and where it fails. Uh, we also end up with a large disruption that ends up happening. And this is, I think it's fundamentally a human problem, rather than an AI type of problem, because there are certain tasks that are new that machines can do that we couldn't, like image generation and script writing. So we end up in a situation where those particular domains end up they end up taking up jobs from those practitioners. But it's not because those practitioners aren't good at that work. It's because it's reduced the amount of effort it takes for those practitioners to get the job done. So what we're seeing more generally is that if you have a skill, you have a domain that you work in, and if AI can integrate into that particular domain, you plus AI is definitely more efficient than you without AI. So you are going to take over somebody else's job who isn't proficient in that, which mandates that we have to upskill in how quickly we use these tools, but also be cautious about when we choose to use these tools, because I maintain that these tools should never be front facing. They should never be customer facing until we get to a level of maturity. They should be behind closed doors. They should be back office. And we should be using it in a way that um, allows us to treat it like a hypothesis generator, like a system that gives us a first pass. So essentially, if you had a job and you use Google to search for information, like when you're coding, you can now use these tools before you go to Google in order to find the information. But it's just to generate hypotheses. It shouldn't, in fact, it be, you shouldn't be using it in order to complete the entire task. We need to validate everything that it looks at. So just generally on intelligence itself, some of the loose consensus is that there are two main axes when it comes to intelligence. The definitions, it hasn't been agreed upon, but some of the definitions are around how do you handle novelty? Can you adapt yourself to new situations? And that involves two types of axes: parts of the human brain that behave intuitively, very quick, that look at your memory, and parts that behave extremely slow, that involve things like search. And at some point, we might end up towards AGI, but I don't want to touch that conversation right now. The curve generally looks like this. We have highly intuitive memory-based systems like lookup tables. We created that at the beginning. And we also had formal reasoners, like the entire banking sector is built up on top of that. And along the way, neural systems came out, LLMs came up, and then we're moving towards newer systems that are starting to come out, like agentic SLMs. And that's going to be what comes next. So let me explain that. Instead of large language models, the world is moving towards smaller language models. So instead of processing on 1,000 GPUs, now we want to see what is the efficiency of a model on one GPU. It's more economical, it's more adaptable. And the problem as well is that it's highly synthetic. We are putting a lot of synthetic data into it as opposed to human generated data. So it becomes more difficult trying to discern what this thing actually knows. Is it from a human or is it from another model? And as we start to move to smaller systems, you'll see how those smaller systems start getting chained with one another into an agentic type of mode. For those of you who've used GPT-4o, it fits into that particular paradigm where we are starting to see inference time computation, where these models are now, instead of giving you an answer immediately using memory lookup, it's now starting to process and churn and have an internal thought pattern in order to start generating. And you'll find that it has a lot of adversarial elements to it. So it starts to think about what's right, what's wrong, what are the tools that it might need, how does it plug into your APIs, what are all of the 1,000 different elements it takes to solve this particular problem, how does it plan around that, and then it starts to pull all of this out. So agentic SLMs are things that you'll start seeing from next year moving onwards from an industry point of view. I think I pointed out some of the risks, but just for brevity, I don't like this idea of move fast and break things. I don't think disruption should be part of our creed at all. It's not actually not part of our creed. We don't want to disrupt, we want to collaborate in the way that we start to build things, which means put things on GitHub, put things in the open, and start to use things that have permissive licenses. Be very wary about that word, especially when the world is starting to have litigation start to play in. So if you're using a system like Claude and you're building your backend on that, be careful about what's coming down that back end from a legal point of view, because now in your company, you're starting to integrate something that might not have the right legislation around it, because this is a very unregulated space. Always validate. Never treat the system like it knows what it's doing, assume that it's wrong. I mentioned that before. Finally, upskill, upskill, upskill. Thank you very much.